A shadow swept over the tiny town of Bramley as the school's intercom crackled to life that October afternoon. Students were barely seated, backpacks half closed, ready to rush to the safety of home. But instead of the final bell, a monotone voice echoed through the halls. "Attention all students and staff. This is a lockdown. I repeat, we are in a lockdown. Lock your doors, close your blinds, and remain silent. This is not a drill." Ms. Lake, the homeroom teacher in room 205, went pale as she hurried to shut the blinds and lock the door. Her students exchanged puzzled glances, whispering nervously. Rumors of violent incidents, horror stories of schools plagued by mysterious forces, flashed through their minds. Most tried to laugh it off as a cruel prank, but something in Ms. Lake's face told them otherwise. In the eerie silence that followed, only the sound of breaths and the occasional creak of old-school walls could be heard. Danny, a tall kid in the back row, whispered to his best friend Jack, "Dude, this is just a drill, right? Why's everyone freaking out?" Jack shrugged, trying to look unfazed, but his hands were shaking under his desk. Ms. Lake hissed, "Quiet, both of you." Her voice was barely a whisper, but there was a tremor in it, one that chilled her students. Minutes passed, then 10, and then 20. A faint shuffling noise echoed from the hallway outside, and some of the students turned toward the door, their eyes wide. Each sound grew more menacing in the silence, each whisper of fabric or step creating more dread. "Stay down," Ms. Lake mouthed, gesturing to the students. "Keep your voices down and stay hidden." At first, the noises seemed faint. Soft steps, the rustling of paper or a jacket brushing against lockers. But soon those sounds grew louder, closer, accompanied by strange, muffled sounds, almost like whispers, though too garbled to understand. "Do you hear that?" Claire, the girl closest to the door, mouthed to Danny, who nodded, his face turning ashen. The noises were unnatural, low, drawn-out groans mixed with a dragging sound, as if someone, or something, was scraping its way down the hall. Jack's hands started to shake visibly, and Claire squeezed her eyes shut, hugging her knees to her chest. Suddenly, the light in their classroom flickered and died, plunging them into semi-darkness. The only illumination came from the faint gray daylight filtering through the slits in the blinds. "Everyone stay calm," Ms. Lake whispered, but her own voice quivered. She could barely control her own terror. Then a loud thump, as if someone had thrown themselves against the door. The entire class jolted, hearts pounding as they stared, paralyzed at the door. There was a long silence, stretching into the unbearable. Just as Ms. Lake raised a finger to her lips, a scratching sound began at the door. Slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their fingernails down the wood. And then, a voice, whispering. It was so faint, most of them thought they imagined it, but the words sent shivers down their spines. "Let me in." The voice was soft, almost childlike, but hollow and sinister, echoing through the room like the distant chime of a bell tolling for the dead. Ms. Lake's face turned as white as a sheet, and she motioned for the students to huddle in the corner, as far from the door as possible. Who's there?" Danny couldn't help himself. His voice was barely a squeak. The whispering stopped. Silence. Then a soft, dreadful laugh, a sound that wormed its way into their minds, twisting their stomachs into knots. Whoever, or whatever, was outside, was laughing at them. "It's okay," the voice rasped, its tone syrupy and condescending. "Just open the door. I'm here to help." Claire buried her face in her arms, shaking uncontrollably. "It doesn't sound human," she mouthed to Jack. Jack nodded, too frightened to respond. He glanced around at his classmates, their faces masks of terror. A strange realization settled in his mind. Whatever was outside, it wasn't here to hurt them. It was here to enjoy their fear, to savor it. Suddenly, the voice turned venomous. "I know you're in there," it hissed, and the words turned into a guttural growl that made them flinch. "You can't hide forever." Ms. Lake clutched a pencil as if it were a weapon, her knuckles white. She'd heard stories, rumors about the Bramley lockdown incident years ago. A lockdown where students had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind nothing but bloodstains and shattered windows. She never thought the story was real. Another thump against the door. And then, they heard the scuff of something moving away from their room, down the hall. Danny exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath. "Do you think it's gone?" he whispered to Ms. Lake. She shook her head. "We're not safe until—" A blood-curdling scream shattered the silence coming from the hallway. It was a boy's voice, high-pitched and filled with pure, unfiltered terror. Every student in room 205 froze, paralyzed as the scream echoed and then cut off abruptly. "Oh, God," Jack whispered, pressing his back against the wall. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. "Shh," Ms. Lake whispered, her eyes darting to the door. The silence was worse than the scream. It stretched, heavy and menacing, until another voice drifted from the hallway. This one soft, pleading. "Help. Please." It sounded like their classmate Sam. Claire gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Sam," she whispered, standing up. "We have to help him." Ms. Lake grabbed her arm, pulling her back down. "No," she hissed. "We stay together. Whatever's happening, it's a trick." They waited, breathing shallowly as the cries grew fainter, more desperate, until they vanished altogether. Minutes ticked by, and eventually the silence became unbearable. Then, as if on cue, the intercom buzzed back to life, startling everyone. "This is Principal Evans. Remain in lockdown. Do not, I repeat, do not leave your classrooms under any circumstances. Help is on the way." Ms. Lake looked at the intercom, her brow furrowed. Principal Evans's voice sounded wrong. There was something distant, disconnected about it, like an echo of a voice rather than the real thing. Jack whispered to Danny, "Did that sound weird to you?" Danny nodded. "Like he wasn't really there." Claire clung to her friend Rachel, trembling. "What if it's not the principal?" she mouthed. "What if whatever's out there is pretending to be him?" The thought hung heavy in the air, and Ms. Lake put a finger to her lips, signaling for silence. But the students' minds raced. What if they were trapped here, helpless prey for whatever was lurking in the hallways? Time crawled by, each second ticking with agonizing slowness. Then, without warning, the doorknob rattled violently, twisting back and forth as if someone were trying to force their way in. The entire class stiffened, not daring to breathe. A scraping sound followed, the unmistakable sound of nails or claws scratching against the door. And then the whispering started again, louder this time, with an edge of impatience. "Let me in." The phrase repeated over and over, building in intensity, growing louder until it was a shout, a command. "Let me in." Suddenly the door shuddered, as if struck by a heavy blow. The sound was deafening, reverberating through the walls and into their bones. Ms. Lake backed away from the door, her face twisted in terror. "What do we do?" Danny mouthed, his eyes wide with fear. She shook her head, at a loss for words. Every instinct told her to protect her students, but how could she fight something she couldn't understand? The pounding on the door stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was almost worse. But then, a different sound drifted into the room. A wet, slithering sound, as if something were crawling across the floor outside. A putrid smell seeped into the classroom, foul and rancid, like rotting flesh. Claire covered her nose, gagging. Whatever was out there, it was something beyond their worst nightmares. A low, guttural growl echoed through the hall, making every hair on their necks stand on end. And then, something scraped against the window. Everyone turned, their eyes wide with horror as they saw a shadowy figure standing outside, peering in through the narrow slit between the blinds. Its face was obscured, but its eyes gleamed with malice, like twin orbs of darkness. The figure pressed a pale, clawed hand against the glass, leaving a smear of dark, sticky residue. It tilted its head as if studying them, savoring their terror. Jack backed away, his legs shaking. What is that?" Ms. Lake didn't answer. She was frozen, transfixed by the figure, her face drained of color. The creature's mouth split into a grin, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. And then, it spoke in a voice that was a sick parody of Principal Evans. "Attention, students and staff. This is the final bell. It's time to come out." The intercom buzzed again, and this time the voice was distorted, warping between high-pitched laughter and low growls, like a radio channel flipping between frequencies. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, but it was faint, barely audible. No help was coming. They were alone with this thing. Danny stood up, his hands clenched. "I'm not staying here," he whispered. "If we're going to die, I'm not going down without a fight." Ms. Lake grabbed his arm. "No, Danny. We stay together." But Danny's fear had shifted into anger, and he shook her off, heading toward the door. Jack and Claire watched, paralyzed, as he reached for the knob. And then, as if in slow motion, the door burst open, flinging Danny backward. The creature from the hallway loomed in the doorway, its grotesque face twisted into a mocking smile. For a split second, the entire class saw it in horrifying detail. A monstrous figure with skin stretched taut over sharp bones, its eyes dark and empty, its mouth dripping with some unknown black fluid. It lunged, and chaos erupted. Screams filled the room as students scrambled, tripping over desks, trying to escape. But there was nowhere to go. Ms. Lake grabbed a chair and swung it at the creature, her face contorted with fear and rage. The chair shattered on impact, but the creature barely flinched. It turned its hollow eyes on her, its mouth curling into a cruel smile. One by one, the students tried to fight, but it was no use. The creature moved with unnatural speed, its claws slashing through the air, leaving trails of darkness in its wake. Jack and Claire huddled together, watching in horror as their friends fell, one by one, until only a handful of them remained. Ms. Lake stood protectively in front of them, her breathing ragged, her eyes filled with determination. "You won't take them," she whispered, her voice trembling but defiant. The creature tilted its head, as if amused, and then, in one swift motion, it lunged at her, its claws slicing through the air. But just as it reached her, a loud, blaring siren echoed through the halls, and the creature recoiled, its face twisted in fury. The siren grew louder, and the creature stumbled backward, its form flickering, becoming less solid, less real. Ms. Lake grabbed the students, pulling them toward the door. "Run!" she shouted. They didn't need to be told twice. They bolted down the hall, past the empty classrooms, past the shattered windows, racing toward the exit. Behind them, the creature's screams echoed, a sound filled with rage and despair. But the siren drowned it out, growing louder, until it was all they could hear. They burst through the front doors, gasping for air, stumbling into the daylight. The town was empty, silent, as if the world itself had been holding its breath. As they looked back at the school, they saw it. The creature standing in the doorway, its eyes filled with a burning hatred. And then, as the siren finally died, it vanished, leaving only a dark stain on the threshold. Ms. Lake, Jack, Claire, and the handful of survivors stared at each other, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. But as they walked away from the school, they knew one thing for certain. Whatever had been trapped inside Bramley High was still there, waiting, lurking in the shadows, biding its time until the next lockdown. Thank you for watching this video. Give it a like, subscribe, and click the bell to receive notifications when I post next video.